So the loneliest part of burnout that no one warns you about is the moment you may need people the most. And it can be the moment you most want to disappear from them too. And I know that because I've lived it. So here's the question I've been thinking about. What if one of the things that could help us recover from burnout is the very thing burnout makes us pull away from? Connection. Because when I started looking at the research on burnout and loneliness, I discovered a paradox that I hadn't fully appreciated. Burnout can make us withdraw, but isolation itself is associated with more burnout. So we withdraw because we're struggling and potentially lose one of the things that might help us through the struggle. Now, in this video, I want to show you what the research says about that relationship, why burnout can feel so incredibly lonely, and why high achievers can find it so difficult to tell anyone what's really happening. And most importantly, what we might do differently if we stop treating connection as something nice to have and started seeing it as part of burnout recovery. And towards the end of this video, I want to share one shift in how I'm beginning to understand loneliness in my own recovery that surprised me. So if you're new here, I'm Behrooz. I'm a public health doctor, and I've spent more than 20 years working in medicine and public health, trained at Harvard, the US CDC, as well as here at the UK's NHS. And I've burnt out at least 3 times, with the most recent time just a few months ago now, probably teaching me more about burnout than anything I've studied academically. Not because I suddenly have all the answers, because I don't, but because this time I've been paying attention to the experience while I'm actually going through it, and I'm recording these videos in real time. And one of the hardest parts has been something that I wasn't expecting: the loneliness. I remember describing this recently and saying, I really don't want anyone else going through what I've been going through because it's so lonely. And there's a strange contradiction in that. I'm surrounded by people. I have my family, I've got friends, colleagues. I know people who care about me. So I'm not necessarily talking about physically being alone. What I'm talking about is that feeling that nobody can quite enter the experience you're having. And sometimes you don't even know how to explain it to them, because from the outside, you may still look functional. You may still be answering emails, going to meetings, taking your child somewhere, smiling even, creating videos like this, getting things done. And yet, internally, something feels profoundly different. So, as I tend to do, I go to the research, and I found 3 things that I think anyone going through burnout needs to hear. So the first thing I discovered is that this experience isn't unusual. One national study of more than 3,000 US doctors looked at social isolation and burnout, and the difference was extraordinary. So amongst doctors in the least socially isolated group, around 15% experienced burnout. And among those in the most isolated group, it was almost 66%. So think about that. Roughly 15% versus 66%. Now, that doesn't prove that loneliness alone caused the burnout, and that's important. There can be many factors involved. But it shows an incredibly strong relationship between social connection and well-being. And then another national study of family doctors found that 45% reported loneliness. That's almost half. And among those experiencing greater loneliness, almost 70% had burnout, compared with about 27% among those who were less lonely. Now again, association isn't causation, but this isn't a trivial relationship. And when I read those numbers, I thought, okay, maybe this feeling isn't just me. Because there's something strange about being a doctor experiencing burnout. You've spent your career being the person people come to when something's wrong. You're supposed to understand health, and you're supposed to be able to cope. You're supposed to know what to do next. And suddenly you're the one who doesn't know. There's a vulnerability in that. And for high achievers, whether doctors, founders, leaders, generally, I think there can be something similar. So if you're normally the leader, the problem solver, the responsible one, the person everybody else relies on. Who do you become when you're the one who can't cope? Sometimes it's easier just to withdraw than answer that question, and that's where the paradox begins. Now, here's the second insight. Burnout doesn't simply coexist with isolation. It may actively make connection harder. So one of the central dimensions traditionally associated with burnout is emotional exhaustion, and another is depersonalization or cynicism. And think about what happens when you're emotionally exhausted. So someone sends you a message. Normally you'd reply, but this time you think, I'll answer later. Someone then invites you somewhere and you don't have the energy, or someone asks, how are you? And giving the real answer feels exhausting in itself. So you say, I'm fine. And every one of those tiny moments can create a little more distance. Not because you've stopped caring about people, sometimes precisely because you don't have enough capacity left to engage with them. And here's where this gets uncomfortable. The strategy that feels protective in the moment, withdrawal, may help maintain the very conditions that make burnout recovery even harder. And the evidence increasingly suggests that social support can buffer burnout. And so research amongst healthcare workers has found that perceived social support is associated with lower burnout, sometimes partly through greater resilience. And a recent network meta-analysis of individual-level interventions for nurse burnout ranked social support second behind mindfulness and just ahead of cognitive behavioral therapy or CBT. Now, again, that doesn't mean having coffee with a friend cures burnout. Burnout has important workplace and organizational drivers too, but it does suggest something we often overlook. Burnout recovery doesn't necessarily happen entirely inside one person. Sometimes it happens between people. And actually, before I share the third insight, which for me is the most important, if you're watching this or listening to this because you're going through burnout yourself and you're not quite sure where you are or what you need to do next, I've created a free guided reflection called the Beyond Burnout Compass. It's not a diagnostic tool or a scoring app. It's not here to tell you how burnt out you are. It's simply a guided conversation to help you reflect on where you are, what's potentially keeping you stuck, and what your next step might be. And you'll find the link in the description below. Because sometimes the first thing we need isn't another solution. It's somewhere safe to begin making sense of what's happening. And that leads directly to the third insight from the research. This is the paradox that stayed with me. Healthcare culture, and I suspect many high-performance cultures, can make vulnerability incredibly difficult. So you're rewarded for competency, reliability, resilience, getting things done, being the person who can handle pressure. So what happens when you suddenly can't? You may not want anyone to know. There can be shame in that, fear of being judged, fear of professional consequences, or simply the thought that other people have bigger problems than me. So you just keep going and you keep quiet. And the people around you may have no idea how much you're actually struggling. And I recognize that in myself. I've spent years studying health and well-being, and I've worked in public health. I've studied prevention. I've helped other people think through difficult problems. And yet, when burnout happened to me, knowledge didn't somehow make me immune to being human. In fact, sometimes I wonder whether my identity made asking for help harder. Because admitting that I'm struggling can feel very different when you're accustomed to being the one with the answers. And perhaps that's why I'm making these videos now, because you can be surrounded by people and still go through burnout almost completely alone. Now, I want to be careful here. I don't want the message of this video to become, you're burnt out because you don't have enough friends. That's not what the evidence says. Burnout has powerful organizational drivers like workload and autonomy and leadership or workplace culture, resources, moral distress. The conditions in which people are being asked to work matters. So if an organization creates intolerable working conditions and then tells employees to join a peer support group, we haven't solved the problem. Connection can't compensate indefinitely for an unhealthy system. But the reverse is also true. Changing the system doesn't mean our relationships and our inner experience suddenly become irrelevant. Recovery seems to be more nuanced than either or, and that's increasingly what I'm discovering in my own burnout journey. My own understanding has also shifted from thinking that the answer was simply changing career, then reducing my work hours, and then focusing mainly on my inner experience, towards now seeing burnout recovery as involving both inner and external change. And I think loneliness sits right at that intersection. So there's one more thing I'm beginning to see, and this is less about the burnout research and more about what I'm learning from exploring the nature of our human experience. So when we feel lonely, it can seem as though the loneliness is coming entirely from our circumstances. Like nobody understands us, or nobody knows what this feels like, or I'm on my own. And those circumstances may be real, but our experience of those circumstances is also being created moment to moment through our thinking. Because that matters. It means the feeling of disconnection isn't necessarily permanent. It's not a permanent description of our life. It's an experience we're having right now. And experience moves, experience changes, and our minds can settle. And sometimes underneath all the thinking about who understands us, who doesn't, what people might think, or whether we should be coping better, there is a natural capacity for connection that hasn't actually disappeared. And maybe burnout doesn't destroy that. Maybe it temporarily just makes it harder to see. And for me, that's a very different starting point, because now connection isn't another item on my recovery checklist, like call 3 friends or join a support group, network more. That's just another project. Instead, perhaps recovery sometimes begins much more simply, with being honest with one person, letting somebody sit beside you without fixing you, or allowing yourself to say, I'm actually not doing very well, and noticing that you don't have to solve the whole future in that conversation. You just don't have to carry this particular moment completely alone. So if you're watching or listening to this and burnout has become lonely for you, I want to give you one very simple invitation, not 10 strategies, just one. Think of just one person with whom you don't have to perform, someone you don't have to impress, someone who doesn't need you to have the answer. And perhaps instead of waiting until you know exactly how to explain what you're going through, just tell them one true thing. Maybe I've been struggling with more than I've been letting on, and that's enough. Because the research has made something very clear to me. Social connection isn't a fluffy extra around the edges of well-being. It matters, but my own experience is teaching me something equally important. We don't necessarily need everyone to understand us. Sometimes we just need somewhere we can stop pretending. And that's one of the reasons I'm documenting this burnout recovery journey publicly. My own burnout has been extremely lonely, and the reason I've chosen to focus the next chapter of my work on burnout is very simple. I don't want somebody else going through this thinking that they're alone. Now, if that's you, you're not the only person asking these questions. I'm still asking them too. So in the next video right here, you'll see something that I explore called moral injury. Because sometimes what we call burnout isn't simply exhaustion. Sometimes we're exhausted because the work we're doing or the system we're doing it in keeps asking us to act against something we deeply care about.